Hey everyone, before we get into the podcast, I just wanted to give you a little context and encourage you. I recently had a prayer session with a pastor that ended up in adultery and was in drug addiction, but his sin all started with watching pornography and he didn't get help. While the thumbnail and the title of this episode are specifically answering a question I personally had around the prayer movement and fasting, the goal of the episode is to help people get free from bondage. So, if this is you, I want to encourage you to seek help. Reach out to Sam for a session. Take advantage of the free materials that are in the description. Find a counselor, find a spiritual leader that you can trust, and pursue freedom. You can get free. You can stay free, and you can walk pure before the Lord. So, that being said, let's get started. Welcome to the Kingdom Awakening podcast. Join us as we look for prophetic insight on current events, hear testimonies from around the world, review church reformation, share biblical teaching, and more. I'm your host, Jeff Simons. I hope this show helps you connect with God.
I've watched pornography, and I've agonized over it. And it's not just been once, it's been one of those things that you've cried and you've fasted and I felt like today I've wondered about this moment my whole life, that I could just say, God, could you break something over a whole generation? Maybe it's okay. That I have a feeling a whole lot of guys in my generation live in deep shame.
Welcome to the Kingdom Awakening podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Simons. I have with me Sam Tielemans. He is a licensed marriage and family therapist out in Vegas. Sam, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate being here.
Well, thank you for joining us. There's something that has kind of been coming up. So I come from the charismatic community and the charismatic background. And one of the things that we practice regularly, we practice deliverance, we practice freedom, prayer, and things like that. And one of the things that has come up repeatedly is people coming forward for prayer for freedom from pornography. And it seems to be an issue that's reoccurring. And when you start to see something over and over, you think, okay, we're not really fixing this. And it occurred to me the other day, and I thought it was a revelation only to find out that Christian therapists have been known this for a while, yourself included, that pornography or sex addiction is a symptom more than it is a root cause itself. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yep.
And so knowing that, like there's root cause type situations. We in the charismatic, we like to focus on the do more. What do I do to fix the thing? And there's an element to that mindset that seems to actually put people in this cycle of try harder, try harder, try harder. So when you're advising people and counseling them, how do you help them to get free from that cycle?
Yeah, it's a great question. And like you said, so I'm a Christian as well, and I believe in prayer. I believe in, I think, divine help. And I've worked with so many people who are Christians. In fact, the friend of mine who originally kind of got me started on this path, in grad school, he opened up and shared with me that he'd been struggling with this issue for years. And I remember very clearly sitting in the break room on this old dingy couch, I had this thought that I need to learn how to treat this issue because I'm sure I'm going to see it a lot in the church. That was this phrase that came to my mind. So I thought, okay, all right, I'm in grad. I don't know what I want to focus on yet in my career, so I'll start here. And I've just seen so many people who are struggling and battling, just like my friend. He would fast once a week. He would attend church every week. He'd talk to his spiritual leaders. Nothing that he'd go to therapy, he'd go to groups, like literally nothing that he was doing was working. And so he had that kind of question about, well, why isn't this helping? And so as he reflected on this, he thought that a part of the reason why he didn't think that he eventually was able to break free from this, but a part of the reason why he thought God didn't just take it from him was because God wanted him to become the kind of person he was meant to be, not just not have this problem. So this goes back to, okay, well, what's causing it then? So I think there's underlying factors that contribute to this. It's a symptom. If somebody's turned into pornography use, typically it's because it's a coping mechanism. They're trying to distract themselves from some kind of an uncomfortable emotion, if they feel like maybe they have low self-worth, or they're lonely, or they're stressed or anxious, depressed. I think there's so many underlying factors that can contribute to somebody turning to pornography to avoid addressing whatever it is that they're feeling. So I think, yes, God wants us to be free from this. And does he have the power to tap us and have it completely disappear? Yeah, I think he does. But I think in most cases, he doesn't do that because he wants us to develop skills. He wants us to fulfill our potential. And as we do that, as we address what's causing the problem in the first place and develop the skills necessary to address it, then the symptom, the pornography use, goes away without having to battle and struggle for the rest of your life with it.
And it's such a common problem nowadays. Is the I think Barna Group just had a research thing that came out fairly recently that 67% of pastors had admitted to a history of pornography issues, and I think it was almost 20%, like 18% currently. And this is in a research piece that they currently are struggling with pornography, and so it's this huge problem. It also has a certain amount of stigma to it, especially for people in positions of leadership, where, for example, I was talking to a friend who's in a certain denomination the other day, and he mentioned that if a pastor, if they admit to having a addiction to pornography, they are mandatory, they have to step down from ministry for 5 years, which you put yourself in that pastor's shoes, and it's, say Mary's got kids, that's your livelihood, and if it comes down to you getting help and potentially losing your income, or you lying about it and trying to hide it and fix it yourself, we've created this condition where people seem to get stuck in shame, and they hide because of the shame. I think that's actually a quote from you, that one of the root problems of pornography is shame. Is that?
That's what I see after having worked with hundreds and hundreds of people. I think shame is such a core issue that drives this, because if somebody feels bad about themselves, like I think about it in the spiritual context, Adam and Eve partake of the fruit, the first thing that they feel is, I've got to hide. So shame is there, and it doesn't promote any growth. It just makes you want to move away from the problem and hide and avoid it and cover it up. And yeah, I think that that's a part of what keeps it. Secrecy fuels this. And so it's unfortunate. It feels like a lose-lose for a lot of these people who are struggling. It's I could come out and say I need help, but then all of these consequences happen as a result of me reaching out, or I keep it to myself and hope that I can overcome it. But people are just have such a hard time overcoming this on their own. That's just not how you do it.
Well, and even for people that have come forward and they say, this is something I'm struggling with. I once visited a certain 12-step program that when I went in, and it was not specifically for sex addiction or pornography, it was any types of addiction. And hearing about the different men that had different struggles of, one had alcohol and one had drug addiction, one was struggling with same-sex attraction, etc. And on one hand, while they were confessing whether they had sinned or not in that week. So it was good. They were taking something that was shameful and they're bringing it into the light in a certain context. But what struck me was they were giving a status update week after week, and still in this mindset of, I am perpetually an addict. So it seems like that's a limitation in some of these programs. And what do you see as the solution for that?
Well, just to speak to that, I agree. I think unintentionally there is this idea that once an addict, always an addict. And they literally, in many cases, will introduce themselves as, hi, I'm Sam and I'm an addict. Hi, I'm John, I'm an addict. And the problem, I think, is that when somebody has this label of I'm an addict, that it's this glass ceiling that prevents them from actually being free from it. Because if you define yourself in a certain way, that comes with you, no matter how much progress you make. It's like, well, I'm 5 years sober, but I'm still an addict. I'm one click away from everything unraveling. I'm one drink away from all this falling apart. When the reality is the brain actually can heal itself, and new neural pathways can form, so that you don't have to be bound by this forever. There's a researcher who I love. His name's Andrew Huberman. He's got a huge social media following. He's a neuroscientist, very, very smart. He talks about pornography use, and he talks about how the brain can rewire itself after 30 to 90 days. And so if you have this idea that I'm an addict, you can be 5 years out, but still think, okay, I have this problem. This is something I always have to be on guard for. When people address the root of it, so what do you do? Like your question earlier. So what do we do with this? How do we address this problem? I think it's just a correct understanding of what the path to freedom actually looks like. You don't have to struggle with this forever. Your brain doesn't struggle with it forever. You can be free from this. And as soon as you get the tools that you need and actually develop the skills necessary to resolve the underlying reasons why you're struggling, that's how you can totally break free from it. In fact, I remember working with a guy one time, and something that he said struck me. He said after about 8 weeks of us working together, he said that he no longer feels victorious about not relapsing. I asked him what he meant by that, and he said, well, this just feels like normal life now. It's not this huge battle. I'm not constantly hypervigilant about it. So it's not some big win of like, okay, cool, it's week number 9, I'm free. He just says he doesn't think about it anymore. And so I think that's the idea, is when you don't define yourself as an addict, and it's just a pattern that you got caught up in, and as soon as you learn the tools and the skills necessary, you can exit the pattern and have this thing be completely behind you. I think that empowers people with confidence, knowing I don't have to battle this forever. I can understand what's driving it, address it, and then move on with my life, instead of feeling like this is going to haunt me and follow me around forever.
Well, okay, so I would say in the past that we used to kind of view this as a guy problem. I think it's less and less just being viewed as just a male's problem now. But that being said, I think the male personality traits tend to lend themselves to certain flaws when it comes to addressing these types of things. One of which is addressing your own root issues. Generally speaking, if a guy has some kind of trauma or pain type thing, they'll take it and they shove it down and they don't process it. And then when it's later down the road, when they start to experience pain or symptoms of pain from past related things, they don't necessarily know where it's coming from. So when you're helping people to identify root cause type things, what are some of the things that you found beneficial for helping them to identify those sources of the issues?
That's a great question. So there's a framework that I like to use because, like you said, a lot of guys have a hard time figuring out what they're feeling, why they're feeling it, and especially if this has been happening for a long time, they're not sure how to discern what's causing it. And so I have a framework that I like to use where when I'm working with somebody, I'll ask them, like, is this a coping mechanism for you? I think it's either a coping mechanism or a habit. So if I can use those two reference points, then I can ask them, okay, well, do you feel like this is something that you use when you're feeling some kind of an uncomfortable or painful emotion? Are you trying to distract yourself from anything? Are there things that you're trying to avoid thinking about or feeling? And if they say yes, I feel stressed, I feel lonely, my self-worth is pretty low, I just don't feel like I'm good enough, I feel like I'm failing. And those are the kinds of things that I don't want to pay attention to. So they use pornography as a way to cope with that. So I think that's one possibility. The other possibility is if it might just be habit at this point. If over years of usage, it's almost like Pavlov's dog. The researcher Pavlov who has these dogs, right? So through association, him ringing the bell and giving the dogs food, the dogs started to pair the sound of a bell with food. And so just by ringing the bell, the dog started to salivate, anticipating there would be like a source of food coming. We're no different as people. Through lots of conditioning and association. So let's say I've worked with people who they're just at home, they're having a good day. It's not in that moment, they're not coping with anything. But then they hear the garage door of their, the wife's like, hey, I got to run an errand. The garage door closes. Just the fact that their wife leaves activates this trigger of like, oh, I'm alone. I can look for something right now. That's just by association. It could be like watching a certain show. It could be anything that leads somebody being alone at night. It's like after work, I get home and I'm by myself. I sit down on the couch. Sitting on the couch just starts to get associated with searching for something. Staying up late at night. Oh, my wife is asleep and I'm alone. Just the awareness of that can activate that association as well. And so once you can identify, is it based in habit or is it a coping mechanism? And a lot of times it's both. That then tells you what steps to take to resolve it. Like you said, it's not a matter of just try harder. It's not a matter of just trying to avoid triggering situations. Because once you address and resolve these associations and these triggers, then you can be alone and not have these thoughts come into your mind. You can have a really stressful day and not feel like, I just want to go search for something. Once you address, again, whatever it is that's causing it, then you actually can feel free instead of having to manage the triggers.
Well, and so I actually interviewed Dr. Andrew Newberg not too long ago, who he coined the term, I think it's neurotheology. And he's not a Christian. He doesn't have any particular religious background, but he does look at various spiritual practices and their connection and how it affects the brain and neuroplasticity. And one of the things that he mentioned was that there was a significant difference between when a couple has sex, that it creates a sense of bonding. And when an individual, and I forget the parts of the brain that get activated in the brain scans, but he said when an individual consumes pornography, it does the opposite. They actually disconnect from reality to a certain extent. And talks about the differences in how you can change the brain. So for those that feel helpless or feel like, or maybe they've been through a 12-step program and kind of reinforce that thing of this is who I always am, they need to hear that there's hope. And I actually heard of a 12-step program recently where the president of the program had a relapse and overdosed. And the effect that had on the entirety of that community was substantial, because now all the people that were believing and looking for that one person of this is the example, but we're always an addict, and that person, when they relapse, it communicates something to them about, well, if there's no hope for them, there's no hope for me. And it creates a sense of despair among people. And so knowing that there's an option, knowing that and you've seen people permanently get free from things that were in heavy types of addiction within pornography and other forms of sexual addiction also, right?
Yeah. For some people, it starts with pornography, then it escalates to affairs and prostitution. And so, yeah, there's people can come back from all of that stuff.
Well, and so I think, there's one part of the story, or I'll just call it a process, where you're getting the shame off. You first, it's kind of a step of repentance, really. You have to acknowledge that you have a problem in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an element of understanding your identity. This isn't, and I've heard you talk about how to help people separate their actions from their identity, that the actions of bringing a poison into a relationship is not them as a person. So how do you help if you're talking to an individual, say a married man, and he's having an issue with pornography and it introduced anxiety and uncertainty into his marriage? How do you help him first to dissect his actions from his identity?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's a big part of how you can help somebody overcome shame. Because shame is this belief that you're bad, whereas guilt is the understanding that maybe you made a bad decision. Those are two totally different things. If I make a bad decision, then it's like, okay, I can figure out what happened, what led to it, and let me change and make a new decision next time. But if I make a bad decision and then describe myself as a bad person because of it, that's when I feel overwhelmed. And so just like what you said, so if a guy is struggling with shame and they bring the pornography into their relationship, him doing that doesn't mean he's a bad person. It just means he has a bad coping mechanism. It just means there's something that he's turning to pornography as a result of some underlying reason that needs attention. That doesn't mean he's bad. He just needs new tools. He needs a new approach. So instead of feeling stressed, let's say he feels stressed and overwhelmed, struggling financially, feels like a failure, then pornography is a part of how he can just distract himself from that for a bit. So the new approach is to figure out, okay, how do I address this stress in a healthy way? How can I process this differently? How can I problem solve more effectively? How can I not be alone in how I feel and talk to my wife about what's going on? Those are the new types of skills that we want him to learn, instead of just beating himself up and like, oh, I did it again. I promised myself I wouldn't do this anymore, yet here I am. I just feel like a terrible person. that'll keep somebody looped into that pattern because they're not addressing why they're there. So that's what I love to do when I work with people is step number one, let's identify what's driving this. What's the biggest core issue? What's the biggest trigger? And then start giving you the skills that you need to break out of that. Start giving you the skills that you need to overcome the underlying issue, not how do we suppress and avoid the urge. But if you're struggling because you don't think you're like, if you see yourself as a failure, then the skill that you need is, or the new belief rather, would be to see yourself as worthy and to feel that. And when you do develop that skill and that belief, and you can actually feel that, then you can have a bad day without beating yourself up, which makes it so you don't turn back to pornography.
Well, it's interesting. So actually another extreme that I see in the charismatic world, which is, so there's first it's identifying that you have an issue, and you talk about identifying the triggers and things like that, and separating your behavior from your identity. We also have an issue where essentially people are kind of gaslighting themselves, where they'll say, "Oh, this isn't who I am," and they just say, they remind themselves of who they are according to the Bible. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but they don't ever come to terms with what they've actually done or how that behavior is affecting themselves or other people. They almost live in this place of denial. How do you help people kind of come out of the denial, or is that something you see?
Yeah, I think a lot of guys will minimize this. I think that they'll minimize the impact it has on their spouse and minimize the impact it has on the people around them or themselves even. And so yeah, I think that unintentionally, if they're trying to talk themselves maybe out of shame, it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, you're not a terrible person for doing this, but what if there was a huge, awful impact this had on your spouse? This needs to be dealt with. It needs to be addressed.
Right.
It can't just be like, I'll commit to do better and then move on without, it's just brushing it under the rug. So yeah, I agree with that.
So do you address it differently depending on the individual? If it's a single person versus a married person versus somebody in positions of authority, or how do you distinguish between your approach?
Yep, that's a good question. So no, not really. What I find is
Okay.
whether somebody's married or a church member or an atheist or whoever, it's all like as different as we all are as people, we're all made of the same stuff. We all have the same types of struggles. We all, it's for so many people, like I said earlier, it's just a coping mechanism. So whether they're married or not, if they're lonely and they turn to pornography, instead of whether it's their spouse or a friend or working through limiting beliefs that they have, it's all the same type of work, the same tools. It's just figuring out what it is that's causing them to turn to it and then getting them the right tool. It's like the matching game, right? I like to think about this process in a really formulaic or systematic kind of way. So sometimes when I work with people in the beginning, I say, listen, this is like the way that I like to work with them is in a 12-week format. And I said, most people, if you just get the right tools in the right direction, you can actually be free from this in just a few months. And when they hear that, it sounds too good to be true because they've been struggling literally for like decades. And so what I say is the good news is there's no magic in this. You don't have to just hope lightning strikes and you're the one who can be free. Rather, it's so formulaic. So if you're struggling with self-worth, then how you overcome this is to develop a strong sense of self-worth. See yourself as worthy. And not through like affirmations and you're trying to convince yourself that I'm enough. Rather, you
Right.
actually feel and believe and can accept and experience your worth. So if you feel low self-worth, the countermeasure to that is developing self-worth. If you are crushed by burdens of stress, the countermeasure or the skill to develop is how do I manage stress effectively? So whatever the problem is, it has like a mirror solution to it. And it's just a matter of figuring out which one is it for you. And once
Hmm.
people can identify, well, this is my main one here. I struggle with this situation. I don't know how to handle stress effectively. I see myself as a failure. When my wife and I get into a fight, then I just feel overwhelmed and I turn to it. Like whatever the breakdown is, there's a bunch of good tools that you can implement to resolve that problem so that then, like we talked about earlier, the symptom, it's just the symptom of pornography. That goes away because you actually deal with it on an underlying level. So Yeah, whoever it is, it's the same approach, which is what's causing it, and let's get you now a handful of good tools to address that underlying reason.
So the finding the tools to resolve the issue can be whatever the triggers are can kind of point to the necessary tool that an individual needs in order to avoid the trigger, or to maybe not avoid it, but to respond to it the next time.
That's exactly it. That's
Okay.
exactly it. And when people understand that, then it's predictable, it's repeatable. You don't have to just like, whoa, how did I get here? What's going on? And why can't I figure this out? And I've been struggling for 10 years. Why, as much as I've tried, it's not working. Usually, when people struggle for 10, 20, 30 years sometimes, it's because they're trying the same approach, expecting a
Mm-hmm.
different result. I'm going to try harder, which means more willpower, more resistance, more avoidance. When really avoiding it isn't the problem, it's addressing it, whatever the underlying thing is, so that there's closure. People will struggle forever. It's like, I don't know, it's sometimes I'll work with people. I use these different analogies, and it's so critical to understand what your triggers are and where the urges are coming from. Because if you don't, how do you solve it? I have this
Right.
analogy of, imagine like you're a new driver and you get this car, like let's say you get like a cyber truck and there's all these little lights in there and it'll tell you what's wrong. So one of these lights flip on and it's like this blue light that spins. And you're thinking, like for me, I know nothing about cars. So if my little check engine light comes on, I'm the kind of person that wants to put duct tape over it and just hope that as I drive, it'll turn off. I think a lot of guys do that with urges. They feel an urge, they feel a trigger, and they're like, oh no, like I don't know what to do. I don't know where this is coming from. It's the same thing as having a car and seeing a check engine light come on and then thinking, well, maybe this means I have to change my oil, or maybe this means I've got to change my brakes. So they go and do it, but then the light doesn't go off. Or they'll, it's like, I'm going to just, try to solve this problem. And it indicates that I need to put gas in my car. If you don't know how to discern what the light means, you'll be trying solutions for a long, long time without any progress because you don't have clarity. But if you do know this light means put gas in your car, how easy is that? This light means change your oil. How simple is that? It's the same thing that whenever there's an urge, urges are just messages. They're trying to send you a signal that something needs attention. But if you don't know how to discern that, again, you're going to think, well, I don't know, maybe I should do push ups. Maybe I should call my friend. Maybe I should say a prayer. Like all those things are good, but they won't solve the underlying issue, and it's all about discerning why are you feeling the way that you're feeling so you can then take a measured step towards resolving it.
So the kind of the mirror of the coping, the tools that people need, and their triggers is interesting because we were talking a little bit before we recorded, and I mentioned that I had read Jay Stringer's book Unwanted, where they included the research that seemed to indicate that, and I'm going to get this statistic wrong, but it was something like to 90% accuracy, they could identify whatever the root trauma that somebody had experienced based on the type of pornography that they consumed. So again, we're still talking about symptoms, right? It's the symptom of what, and I would not recommend that people just overanalyze it, because then you just bring yourself back into a darkened mind, or state of mind. But understanding if there's a certain type of thing that they are pursuing, it may indicate something that they lacked, or an emotional need that was unmet, or some kind of trauma from their past. So there's this connection between the behavior now, and not overlooking it, not just suppressing it, but saying, okay, why am I doing the things that I'm doing? And we in the charismatic space, is something you mentioned, that people have spent years trying the same thing over and over. And we just had the last year, at the end of October of 2024, the scandal with Mike Bickle, and it was largely publicized that he had been inappropriate with multiple women for an extended period of time. Prior to that, we had Lou Engle, who was one of the leaders in the prayer movement. So both of these who stood up in front of, I think it's like 10,000 people and admitted to having watched pornography. Who this was like the guy who was anti-pornography and praying for purity in the nation and those things. So on one hand, I applaud him for having the courage to stand up and say that in front of 10,000 people, who knows how many people online. But on the other, it makes me think, okay, if these guys who are supposed to be spearheading a movement of purity, if they are continually struggling with something and fasting and prayer is the solution that they're viewing as this will fix it all, they've been trying the wrong solution. And it's a charismatic way of striving is how I would kind of articulate it, where it seems to not profit in the way that people think. So how often is it that people are just stuck in their cycles and they don't even know that there's another way to approach it?
I think most of the time, unfortunately, I think people are just unaware. They do think it just requires more effort. And I think effort is a really helpful tool here, but I think directing your effort not towards suppressing urges, but directing your effort towards developing skills. I think that's how you can actually exit this cycle. It's all about skill building. So when you can identify where the breakdown is, let's say you get into a fight with your wife. As a result of that, you feel lonely and rejected. There's two skills you can learn there. Number one, starting to change how you see yourself, right? If it's like, oh, my wife doesn't want me, I'm a failure, I'm not enough. So breaking those limiting beliefs about yourself is one approach. Then the second one is, if you guys keep getting into fights, it just probably means you need more communication skills. It just maybe there's misunderstandings, maybe you're taking things personally. Whatever the problem is, there's a set of skills that you can learn to address that problem. And once you can approach it in that way, people actually can get free of this, which I know seems like a far-fetched idea to a lot of people maybe listening to this, because if they've been struggling for literally decades and they've tried everything they can think of, it's so discouraging. So yeah, just not knowing what else to do makes it so they unintentionally stay stuck. So I hope that when people hear this, that there is no magic, and that's actually a good thing. It's just learning where things break down and what skills you need. You can actually truly overcome this without continuing to struggle forever.
Well, and it can, especially as a minister too, it can start to be discouraging where you see the research and it's not like pornography as an issue is somehow like decreasing in society. It's doing the opposite.
Right.
And especially even in the Christian community, I think it was 50 some odd 54% or something like that is what Barna said for Christians. Now, as Christians abroad, it's not explicitly defining ministers or church attendees, but those that identify as Christians that have an issue, that confess to occasionally watching pornography. 54% is a huge number.
Yep.
And I have a friend who she had one of the biggest podcasts in the U.S. about probably 10 years ago. She had the number 2 Christian podcast, and in prayer one day she felt like God said, "Shut the podcast down. You need to go be a counselor." So she shut the podcast down, just deleted it all, and went to get her license as a counselor. And the reason was that God told her that people would be in need of therapy and counseling in a significant manner from Christians. So, and now we're starting to see significant issues with church hurt. You know, I'm in the Dallas area where we have the Gateway scandal and all these different church scandal issues where people have all kinds of things that need attention. And this has come up several times, and in groups that I'm connected to, where it's not just men now, it's women, it's a significant reoccurring issue for those that have issues with addressing their emotions, I think. And they're using this to cope, because it's essentially a free drug if you think of it like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's exactly what happens for people. It's just they're coping. So many people struggle with this, and I think it's just like social media. They have bright people trying to engineer how to keep people hooked to this. And so people will struggle for a long, long time, and so many people do. So I think it's great that you're trying to get the word out to people who are listening, people who are following, letting them know there's ways to resolve this. You don't have to struggle forever, because I just think people need hope. They need direction. So many people just don't know where to start or where to turn. So I think it's just so important to get the information out.
Well, I think, we've, again, I'm going to defer back to the charismatic community. We tend to focus on, we want something quick. We want to see a healing right now. We want to see the miracle right now. We want to see somebody delivered right now. And in doing that, oftentimes what gets devalued is when people go through process. And the other element that can be devalued is really the medical community at large, depending on where you are in which church or group like that, where the default advice. I was talking to a minister the other day, and I asked him. He went through a restoration process. He was addicted to pornography, and he went for 4 years. He stopped being a minister and just focused on his marriage and going through therapy. And I said, "What was one of the things that everybody tried that just didn't seem to work?" And he said, "Deliverance." That everybody just wanted to cast the demons out, and then they were telling my wife to leave me because because he was addicted to it and didn't know what to do about it. And thankfully he got connected to a good group of pastors in a church that had an understanding of this isn't just something that you can, and again, like you said earlier, it doesn't mean that God can't do it, where it's just an instant, but you don't develop maturity in an instant. It can't be imparted in an instant. You don't wake up from a dream and have maturity. Maturity comes, and when I say maturity, I mean the development of a character of integrity is something that has to be worked towards. And there's an element to that where it's being aware of our own emotional state and things that we're going through, and not just trying to suppress it.
Yeah, I agree. That's the key right there. Is it's recognizing that there's skills and maturity and development that needs to take place. And could God take away the urges that you feel? Yeah, I think he can. I think he ultimately, though, wants you to align with your potential, to ultimately fulfill your potential. And a part of what that looks like is development, it's growth, it's progress, it's becoming. And so that's, in my opinion, like that's the message of like hope and healing, is you can actually become and overcome this issue through becoming. And once you do that, then again, the symptom takes care of itself.
Well, and just we'll throw a little bit of Bible in here for those that are looking for a scripture on it. Colossians 2, it actually, Paul makes the case that this is not something that you're going to solve by fasting. So Colossians 2 verse 20, since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. These rules, so implying rules on ourselves, these rules which have to do with things that are destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teachings. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. So this idea of do more or don't do this, or imposing these types of restrictions, and this is another common thing that I see is, somebody has an issue with, they confess it. They've had a lapse and maybe they don't have it as I forget the distinction that you had, but it's not an addictive thing. It's a coping thing. And they said, well, I'm going to put these restrictions on my phone or my internet or whatever. And it sounds right. It sounds like it's wisdom. But if you don't get to that root issue, you know what? It's not going to stop it.
That's why I think it's so necessary to figure out what's causing that. Because it's not a being home alone issue. It's not a technology issue. It's something underlying beneath that. And again, once you identify that and get the skill that you need to solve the problem, you can be at home alone with unfettered access to every device in your house. You can be there by yourself for months, and it won't even affect you. You won't even think about it because it's been addressed. So it's so critical to figure out where this is coming from.
So, okay. So what are some of the common areas that you see where people have these root cause issues? Like, what are some of the most common root cause things for those that, I don't know, that maybe they say, well, it's coming from somewhere, but I don't know where. What are
Yep.
the common ones that you recognize?
There's three common ones. Number one, negative beliefs about yourself. I'm a failure. I'm not enough. I'm not worthy. I'm bad. Right? When somebody beats themselves up and has this negative view of themselves, that doesn't we don't do well as human beings with like low self-worth like that. It's too painful, it's too overwhelming. So we want to get away from that. So that's number one, is beliefs. Number two, emotions. Stress, fear, anxiety, worry, loneliness. When people feel that and they don't know how to manage that effectively, that's another reason why people will turn to some kind of a behavior or substance. And then three, I think it's associations. You might be having a fine day, but then you realize like, oh, I'm at home alone. That'll just trigger this like Pavlov's dog type of response. So most people have, it's like those are the three layers, right? And I think most people have a combination of all of them or at least one of them. And once you figure out which, that's why again I like to use that framework: belief, emotion, habit. Because if you can assess, okay, what are some of the situations where I feel this urge? Well, when I'm alone. Does that mean being alone is a problem? No, not no. It's that could mean it's just associated. You need to just repattern being alone and have a new routine for that moment. But mostly it's when you're alone, there's been this pressure cooker of how you feel about yourself and other negative emotions, that when you're alone, that's when everything surfaces. So those are the three most common sources that I like to walk people through, is have them consider things on those levels to then identify what it could be in that category.
So when you're taking somebody through this, do you take them in any particular sequence through, identifying triggers and root causes and reinforcing identity things, or how do you approach it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I like to start with what's the biggest needle mover? Where are you most struggling? What's the most common trigger that you have? What's the biggest underlying reason? And so I'll ask them, do you just in the very beginning, if somebody reaches out, that's my question typically is this a coping mechanism for you? Or is it just like a habit? Or when do you notice yourself feeling the urge? And then they'll reflect on situations, they'll reflect on feelings that they're trying to cover up. So I like to start off by asking, do you feel like this is coping or not? And if they say yes, then we'll explore what feelings are they trying to get away from? And then how do they see themselves? Is there shame? Is there feelings of unworthiness? So I like to start off, I want to move the needle as much as we can, on day number one. So typically I'll ask and explore if it's a coping mechanism.
Okay. Well, so Sam, you have Healing Couples, healingcouples.org. You have a practice in Vegas. You have a podcast. We'll put all the links in the description below. Is there anything else that is places that people can find you?
Yeah, those are the main ones. On my
Okay.
podcasts, I give away. I don't gatekeep anything, so I literally just give everything away for free. It's just every tool. With the podcast, there's just no system, right? It's like if I have a conversation with somebody and think, oh, that'd be a good episode, I go and do that. But like literally everything's on there. So people who are interested, you can just go to. It's on all the platforms, but it's called Couples Healing from Pornography Addiction. That's probably the easiest way if people are just looking for resources.
Awesome. Well, Sam, thank you for your time and for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, Jeff.
All right. Well, bless you.